I will try not to force you to stand up. Influence, barring territorial conquest, presupposes knowledge. And so the first thing I think we have to say is about the huge asymmetry of knowledge between the West and India. An educated Westerner knows much, much less about India than an educated India knows about the West. Now, this is a phenomenon that characterizes each and every relationship of the West and the rest. But in the case of India, given the ancient and incredibly rich tradition, cultural heritage, this assumes truly astonishing proportions. And it deserves awareness insofar as this distortion is harmful to human culture as such, as well as to West-India relations. Now, the lack of real, serious, and deep knowledge of India has been replaced by the exotic. Orientalism was born, the idea, the concept, it's somebody from the Middle East who focused especially on the Middle East, but Orientalism, as we all know, is also applicable to the way the West has seen and represented India. A personal note, now, growing up as a child in Italy in the 50s, my favorite readings were the books of a minor writer called Emilio Salgari. There were books of adventures taking part, especially, in an imagined India that the author had never visited and knew little about. So it was there that I first read words such as Maharaja, Marathis, thugs, Hugli, Kali, fakirs, jungle. This was my first contact with India, but it was a totally imaginary and Orientalist view of India. Now, in the 1960s, we saw another, less fantasy-like, but still partial and unreal view of India, the India of the Beatles, India seen as a countercultural model, as an antithesis to the repression of modernity and productivity. A land of pure spirituality, of gurus, ashrams, and sitars. Words are always the first thing that travels across borders. It would be unfair, however, to stop at what has constituted a superficial and popular view of India and Indianness without registering the impact and influence of India on Western thinkers and artists, which is a serious dimension. Now, the few minutes at my disposal do not allow even a cursory view of all this. It's a huge subject. But what can be mentioned here is the main reasons for the powerful attraction that India has exerted on the Western educated mind, on the Western educated mind. I would venture to say that India captures the West because it is perceived as endowed with cultural features that the West either does not possess or feels it has lost. There is no doubt that the great Western achievements in science and technology, even in the construction of complex political systems, has been based on the capacity to distinguish, separate, define, prioritize. The Western path from the philosophers of Greek antiquity, when knowledge was all comprehensive and not separable in different disciplines, up to the Cartesian clarity, has been objectively fruitful. But it is impossible not to recognize the price that has been paid. A price in terms of a sort of flattening of the marvelous variety of human experience and especially sensitivity. India is not Cartesian, and the Western mind sees an irresistible attraction, a sort of refreshing relief in a culture that in the first place has little use for the deep, systematic, relentless dualism that characterizes the Western mental world. Matter and spirit, body and soul, rationality and irrationality, yes and no. The binary logic, the strict binary logic. A binary logic and also logic and ethical mode right and wrong, that we cannot give up because of very ingrained roots, but that we feel deep down that shortchanges us, impoverishes us. The popular view of India is one of liberating spontaneity in distinct sensual fruition proved by the global popularity of the Kama Sutra, as if India were an anti-intellectual, instinctive, sensual alternative to Western intellectualism, moralism, repression. Now, on a more sophisticated intellectual level, as shown by a survey of the reflection of Western thinkers and artists, the idea of India focuses, on the contrary, not on alternatives, but on the blending and tension of opposites. No either or, nor black and white, no uncompromising right or wrong. And this has a reflection also on the way India has been developing through the ages, not by dialectical overcoming of previous historical, religious, cultural stages, but by the formation of layers, each of which is not overcome and destroyed, but remains. An Italian journalist once wrote that he was astonished when an Indian acquaintance asked him, "How many followers of Jupiter are there today in Rome?" Adding instead of destroying. It's not a minor trait, and this is what makes India so fascinating for the Western mind, at least for mine. Allow me to say here, turning this a little bit around, that although it is true that, as Alberto Moravia wrote, Italy is a country, an area of violent originality, one should avoid an extreme, not nuanced view of difference between the West and India, because you can exaggerate in saying we're all the same, but you can also exaggerate in depicting the other as being a UFO or totally alien. This is not the case, otherwise it would be almost impossible to communicate. Now, it is indeed a fact that although Western thought has been overwhelmingly dualistic, there have been exceptions, and interesting ones. Well, Spinoza, when he says, Deus sive natura, means God, i.e. nature. Well, sounds terribly Indian to me. And also he writes, quote, in his Ethics, quote, "The mind and the body are one and the same thing," end quote. Sounds Indian? Well, it's West also. So this makes the dialogue more possible because we're not, also the West is not flat. Or even he writes, and here I venture in a territory that I shouldn't venture in, because he writes that hope and fear, Spinoza, are to be abandoned in the pursuit of a higher degree of human perfection. And it seems to me that there is something in the Vedas where it says that desire is an imperfection to be discarded. So, again. And how about Indian materialist and an atheist thought, which sounds to me like Epicurus or Lucretius? Anyway, I'm saying this because I'm convinced that in addressing and even appreciating the difference, we can, as I said, we can exaggerate. One example, a big one, it's about Hindu polytheism. Now, contrasted too radically with the Abrahamic monotheistic tradition, it is enough to talk to any educated Indian to understand that the myriad of gods that the Hindu tradition has displayed should be seen as the necessary path, necessary from a cultural, but also from an aesthetic point of view, to a divine essence, the Brahman, which is not so distant, after all, from monotheism. I don't see such a huge difference. I will venture to say, however, that the most radical, deepest difference between the West and India does not relate to theology, but to the moral sphere, and especially to concepts such as sin and guilt. Another personal anecdote. I remember here a visit I took to Kerala during the 2 years I spent in India. My wife and I were visiting the palace of the Rajas in Cochin, accompanied by a local lady who happened to be a Christian. After interpreting for us a fresco depicting gods frolicking with beautiful, naked young women, she added with irony, but also with a twinge of regret. You see, it is beautiful, but for us Christians, it's not really possible to enjoy all this as it is for the Hindus. We fear sin. We feel guilt. Now, Alain Daniélou would have loved this remark. Moving to the present time, we should ask ourselves whether today, at the level of popular culture, a distorted, Orientalist, partial view of India has been replaced by a more complete and more respectful view insofar as it's more truthful. But today there is another conventional wisdom. There is another flattening of the image, because now India is known and admired as a capitalist success story, dynamic economy, and rapid transformation. I'm afraid indeed that the superficiality of the past has been inverted and not removed. Again, simplification, again, lack of respect for a reality that's characterized by an amazing degree of internal difference. Of course, following the intricate paths of Indian diversity is not for the lazy. And it is much easier to just replace elephants with steel plants, tigers with software producers, gurus with engineers. The result is that India still largely escapes the West because, you know, it's neither the total other and it's not like us either. Its mix and contradiction between materialism and spirituality is not resolved, and we believe cannot be, and we believe shouldn't be. Because India, as I said before, is not a land of dialectics, where antithesis replaces thesis and is eventually resolved in synthesis, but where opposite polarities remain strong and in constant tension. A land where, as I mentioned before, nothing is overcome or replaced, but where history and culture grow in superimposed layers, and the most ancient is not eliminated by the most modern. Now, the West has a lot of work to do in order to start addressing and to try to comprehend this extraordinary, fascinating reality. But I think that India has a lot of work to do too, since it should discard itself a flat view of modernity, and while being legitimately proud of its modern achievement, should never forget nor occult its internal contradictions. And it's not just a view. I'm talking here about practice. You know, the idea that in India somebody might believe that the time has come to join what the French call la pensée unique, la pensée unique of neoliberal dogma, it would be really more than a waste. It would be a crime if this were to prevail. I don't think it will prevail, but there is a lot of work to do in culture, there is a lot of work to do in the media, there's a lot of work to do in literature to preserve an idea of India that's also a reality of India. The fact, indeed, that contradictions do not have to be resolved in a homogenizing view of economic development and modernity, without giving it up, because not for us the reactionary utopias of going back to an idealized past which never existed anywhere, but also the idea that preservation doesn't mean lack of progress. But it's, again, a very typical Indian approach that preserves the contradictions, is something that, as was said before, can teach something also to the world. And this could be the real influence, as was said before. I haven't spoken about politics, but I think that politics is a very interesting case in point, both in the positive and in the negative. Because, you know, being Italian, I see so many similarities, and maybe in politics, they're not the best part of our two countries, from corruption to make a long list. But if we can cope with those, let's say, shortcomings, then we can give something also to the world at large. Thank you.